My brother's wedding gift to our parents was supposed to be 3 weeks of help around the house. What it actually became was a slow-motion hostile takeover that I didn't find out about until I showed up unannounced with a casserole and found my mother eating lunch on the back porch steps because, quote, the dining table was being used for a project. She was sitting on the concrete, her bad knee bent at an angle that had to hurt, balancing a paper bowl of soup on her lap. She looked up when she heard the gate, and the first thing she did, before saying hello, before smiling, was glance back through the sliding glass door to check if anyone had seen her let me in. That look on her face is what I keep coming back to. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just reflex. The reflex of someone who had been made to feel like a guest in her own home for long enough that she'd stopped questioning it. My name is Sutton. I'm 31 years old. I work as a licensed home appraiser, which means I spend my days walking through other people's houses and calculating what they're worth. I know square footage. I know structural integrity. I know the difference between a house that's been loved and one that's been used. And when I stepped through the back door of my parents' house that Saturday afternoon, I knew immediately which one I was walking into. It didn't feel like theirs anymore. Let me back up. My parents, Rosalind and Jean, spent 38 years in a 3-bedroom ranch house in Beaverton, Oregon. My dad worked commercial HVAC his entire career. Crawl spaces, rooftops in January, boiler rooms in August. My mother was a school librarian for 26 years. They were the kind of parents who bought generic cereal so my brother Caden and I could go on the class trip to Washington, D.C. They drove their cars until the transmissions gave out. They never once took a vacation that required a plane ticket. When my dad retired at 64, his back was held together by 2 steel rods from a surgery he'd put off for 3 years because he didn't want to miss work. When my mom retired the following spring, she cried in the parking lot of the school because she didn't know what she was supposed to do with herself without it. They deserved better than the ranch house. They deserved better than the neighborhood that had gotten louder and more cramped over the years. Better than the leaking gutters and the drafty windows my dad kept recalking himself because he couldn't justify the cost of a contractor. So I did something about it. I'd been saving aggressively since I was 24. No fancy apartment, no expensive car, no vacations I couldn't drive to. When I turned 29 and had enough for a substantial down payment, I started looking. I spent 8 months finding the right place. A 3-bedroom Craftsman on a quiet street in Tualatin, with a covered back porch, a fenced yard big enough for a garden, a main floor primary suite with a walk-in shower my dad could use without stepping over a tub ledge. Accessible. Comfortable. Theirs. I paid for it myself. Mortgage in my name, structured as a revocable living trust with my parents as primary beneficiaries. I'd spoken to my financial advisor and an estate attorney to make sure it was done right. The monthly note was manageable for me. The plan was always that they'd live there rent-free, and eventually the property would transfer cleanly to them or to a successor beneficiary without going through probate. The day I gave them the keys, my dad sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Sutton, this is too much." And my mother put her hand over his and said, "It's not. She's right, it's not too much." That was 14 months before the afternoon I found her eating soup on the back porch steps. Here's what happened in those 14 months. My brother Caden met Petra about 4 years ago. She's 36, works in brand partnerships, which as far as I can tell means she negotiates sponsored posts for mid-tier influencers and attends a lot of networking events. She and Caden got engaged last year. She moved into his apartment in Northeast Portland, and within about 6 weeks of that, I started hearing small things from my mother. Little comments. Petra had asked my mom's opinion on wedding centerpieces, then dismissed every suggestion. Petra had told Caden that my parents' offer to host a rehearsal dinner was sweet, but not really the vibe they were going for. Petra had mentioned, apparently more than once, that their Northeast Portland apartment felt cramped now that she was working from home full-time. I didn't say much. Caden seemed happy. Petra was clearly high maintenance, but lots of people are. I figured they'd figure it out. What I didn't figure was that Petra would solve her square footage problem by slowly colonizing my parents' house. It started, according to my mother, the weekend after Thanksgiving. Caden called and asked if they could store a few boxes in the spare room while they rearranged the apartment. My parents said of course. The boxes arrived in a U-Haul. There were 37 of them. Petra directed the whole thing from the driveway in a cashmere coat, pointing where each one should go. They stayed for dinner. Then they stayed the night. Because Petra said she was too tired to drive back. Then they stayed the next night because Caden had an early Monday meeting and it was closer. And then, somewhere in that span, it stopped being a visit and started being a residency. Except nobody said that out loud, because saying it out loud would have required a confrontation, and confrontation is the thing my parents are least equipped to handle. My dad is the kind of man who apologizes to strangers who bump into him. My mother spent 26 years managing a room full of children and never once raised her voice. They are, both of them, constitutionally incapable of making someone feel unwelcome. Petra had figured this out almost immediately, and she had built her entire strategy around it. By the time I showed up with that casserole, they had been living in the house for 6 weeks. Petra had taken over the primary suite, explaining to my mother that she had severe sleep issues and needed the blackout curtains and the attached bathroom. My parents had moved into the smaller guest room upstairs, the guest room with the narrow staircase that my dad took carefully, one hand on the rail because of his back. The guest room with the window that faced the neighbor's fence. The room I had never intended for them to sleep in. The dining table had been turned into Petra's content workspace, which meant it was covered in ring lights, a camera on a tripod, fabric samples, and 3 half-assembled product boxes she was photographing for a client. My mother couldn't use her own dining table. She'd been eating breakfast at the kitchen island and, apparently, lunch on the back porch steps when Petra was on a call and the kitchen felt too exposed. I stood in that kitchen and looked around and took inventory the way I do in a professional capacity, except instead of calculating value, I was calculating damage. The magnetic knife strip my dad had mounted over the stove, gone, replaced with a floating shelf holding small succulents. My mother's ceramic rooster that had sat on that counter since before I was born, nowhere. The framed cross-stitch my mother had made the year I was born, the one that had hung in every kitchen they'd ever had, gone from the wall near the window, replaced with a large black and white print of a bridge I didn't recognize. My parents' house looked like an Airbnb that someone had redecorated to appeal to a younger demographic. I found my mother's rooster in the hall closet, wrapped in a dish towel like something being sent to storage. I went back outside and sat with her on the steps. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. She looked at her soup. "It's not as bad as it looks, Mom." She has a lot going on, the wedding planning and the work and the apartment situation. "Mom, where is the cross-stitch? The one from the kitchen?" She didn't answer right away. She said the frame didn't work with the new shelf. I didn't say anything. I sat there for a minute with my hands around my own knees, looking at the backyard that I had specifically chosen because it had room for a vegetable garden, which my mother had been wanting for 20 years. There was no garden yet. There was a large patio furniture set Petra had ordered. Sectional sofa, 2 ottomans, a propane fire table, arranged across the entire usable lawn space. It looked like a showroom. There was no room for a garden bed. There was barely room to walk to the fence. I went back inside. I was calm. I've trained myself to be calm, professionally, because nothing useful ever comes from showing all of your cards at once. I walked through the main floor slowly. I looked at the primary suite door, which was closed. I could hear Petra on the other side talking on the phone, something about an activation budget and a deliverable timeline. I walked upstairs. The spare room. My parents' room, the room they had been moved into, had a full-size bed pushed against one wall, both their overnight bags on the floor because there was no room for a proper dresser, and a small window that let in about 40 minutes of good light in the morning. The closet had a hanging rod and 2 shelves. My mother had folded her clothes into the small rolling suitcase she used for weekend trips because there was nowhere else to put them. On the nightstand, there was a library book and my dad's glasses case. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I went back downstairs, poured myself a glass of water, and texted my brother. "Are you home?" "In about an hour. Why?" "Come to Mom and Dad's. We need to talk." He sent back a thumbs up. That was it. A thumbs up, as if I had suggested getting coffee. I waited in the kitchen. My mother tried to offer me something to eat, and I told her to sit down and stop taking care of me for 5 minutes. She smiled at that. She seemed almost relieved to have someone to sit with. When Caden got there, Petra was with him. She came through the door first, tossed her bag on the console table in the entryway, the console table that had been my parents', without breaking stride, and said, "Oh, Sutton, you're here. I didn't know you were coming." The way she said it wasn't quite a complaint and wasn't quite a welcome. It was the tone you use with someone who's dropped by your home unexpectedly, which told me everything I needed to know about who she believed this house belonged to. I said, "I brought dinner. Can we all sit?" Petra made a face. "The table is kind of in the middle of something." "I know," I said. "I saw. We can clear one end." She looked at Caden. He looked at the floor. He was doing that thing he does when he's uncomfortable, which is a kind of whole body stillness, like if he stops moving, the situation will resolve itself without his participation. We cleared one end of the table, or rather, I cleared it, moving the ring lights and the camera and the fabric samples to the far side with quiet, systematic efficiency. Petra watched me do it with her arms crossed and said nothing. We sat down. My parents, Caden, Petra, and me. "I want to understand what the current living situation is," I said. I wasn't going for confrontational, I was going for matter of fact. "You're both staying here full time now?" Caden nodded. "The apartment lease is up at the end of the month. We figured since we're going to be married in 4 months, it made more sense to move in here," I finished. "Temporarily," Petra said. Her chin went up slightly. "While we look for something in the right price range. It's a difficult market." "I work in the market," I said. "I know what it looks like. What I'm asking is, did anyone discuss this with Mom and Dad? Like a real conversation?" Silence. My mother looked at the table. My dad cleared his throat. "They're family," Petra said, "the way you say something you believe ends a conversation. And we're contributing. We bought groceries this week. We've been handling some of the yard stuff." I looked at the yard through the sliding glass door. At the patio furniture showroom. At the absence of the garden my mother had been planning for 20 years. "Mom," I said, "do you want to tell me about the primary suite situation, or should I?" My mother's eyes went to Petra. That reflex again. "It just made more sense," Petra said quickly before my mother could speak. "I work from home. I need the attached bathroom for my routine. And honestly, Rosalind and Jean don't use a bathtub anyway." "That's not a walk-in tub," I said. "That's a walk-in shower. It was specifically chosen because my dad can't step over a tub ledge safely. The suite was designed for them. The whole point of that room is accessibility." Petra blinked. "He seems fine." "He has 2 steel rods in his back, Petra." "Sutton," Caden said, a warning in his voice. "Or an appeal." I couldn't always tell the difference with him. "I'm not attacking anyone," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm not attacking anyone," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm asking questions. I want to understand what decisions were made and when, and I want to understand why my parents are sleeping in an upstairs room with their clothes in a suitcase." The table was quiet. Petra looked at her nails. Caden looked at the window. My parents looked like they were waiting for something to stop, the way you wait for a car alarm to go off. "I want to be clear," I said, "that I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable, but I do need to understand something." I looked at my brother. "Caden, do you know how this house is structured legally?" He frowned. "You bought it. It's yours." "It's an irrevocable living trust," I said. "With me as the trustee, meaning I have sole legal authority over how it's used, who lives here, and what terms are attached to any occupancy. There's no lease for any additional residents, which means anyone beyond Mom and Dad is here at my discretion." Petra's expression changed. "Not a lot, but enough." A slight tightening. "So technically," I continued, "everything that has happened in this house over the last 6 weeks, the room reassignment, the furniture rearrangement, the removal of my parents' personal items, happened without any legal or formal authorization, from me or from them." "They're personal items," Petra said, her voice cooler now. "I reorganized. I didn't throw anything away. You put my mother's rooster in the hall closet wrapped in a dish towel. I was going to find a better place for it, and the cross-stitch, the frame was wrong for the Petra." I put both hands flat on the table. "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it honestly. When you moved into the primary suite and moved my parents upstairs, did you think about whether either of them had actually agreed to that?" She opened her mouth, closed it, Because my mother's knee bothers her on stairs, I said. And my father's back doesn't allow him to carry anything heavy from a second-floor room. And both of those things were part of why this house was specifically chosen, specifically structured, and specifically paid for the way it was. Not for a guest room. For them. Caden's face had gone through several stages during the speech. It had started at uncomfortable, moved through defensive, and arrived somewhere I could only call reckoning. He was looking at my dad who was sitting with his hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from, looking at the table. "Dad," Caden said quietly, "did you want to move upstairs?" My dad didn't answer right away. He turned the mug in his hands. Then he said, "You seemed like you needed the space." That was it. That was the whole architecture of what had happened in this house. Not malice from my parents. Not stupidity. Just a lifetime of putting everyone else first, so thoroughly and completely that they'd stopped even recognizing when they were doing it. "I don't need the space at the cost of your back," Caden said, and his voice came out rough. He was getting there. But he wasn't all the way there yet, and I couldn't wait for him to arrive. "Here's what I need to happen," I said. "And I'm going to be direct, because we'll waste less time that way. Mom and Dad move back into the primary suite. Tonight. All of their things go back downstairs, and everything that was moved or reorganized on the main floor goes back to where it was. The dining table gets returned to what it is, which is a dining table, not a studio setup." I looked at Petra. "You're welcome to stay in the guest room for a reasonable amount of time while you find housing. I'm willing to define that as 60 days. At the end of 60 days, I'll need the house back to a 2-person occupancy. If you want to formalize anything, we can do it with a written guest agreement that my attorney has drafted. But there will not be a lease, and there will not be a transfer of rights or interest in this property to you or to Caden, unless I initiate it. Is that understood?" Petra looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Caden, and her expression did something complicated. It was the look of someone recalculating, someone who had believed, genuinely believed, that she was holding a winning hand and had just been shown otherwise. "You can't just," she started. "I can," I said. "I looked it up before I came over, and I called my attorney on the way here. Oregon law is pretty clear on this. You have no lease, you've been here under 30 days, and you have no documented financial contribution to the property. You're guests. I can ask you to leave tonight if I want to. I'm offering 60 days and a respectful transition instead, because my brother loves you and I love my brother. But the offer is not negotiable." Caden was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's right, Petra." Petra's jaw tightened. "She's right," he said again, more firmly. "This isn't our house. I should have talked to Georgia, to Sutton." He exhaled. I'm sorry to both of you," he said, looking at our parents. "I let this get away from me." My mother reached over and put her hand on his arm. "That's who she is. That's who she's always been." Petra stood up. She didn't storm off. She was too controlled for that. She picked up her water glass, set it in the sink with deliberate calm, and walked down the hall to the primary suite and closed the door without slamming it, which was almost worse than slamming it somehow. What happened next was slower and quieter than I expected. Caden helped my dad carry their overnight bags back downstairs. I remounted the magnetic knife strip. Caden had kept the screws in a kitchen drawer, which was either an accident or some form of guilt preservation. My mother found her rooster in the closet and set it back on the counter without a word, just smoothed her hand over the ceramic glaze like she was checking that it was still intact. I took the framed print of the bridge off the wall and leaned it against the baseboard. I found the cross stitch in the hall closet, still in its frame, glass intact. I rehung it in its spot by the window. My mother came in while I was leveling it and stopped in the doorway and pressed her fingers to her mouth. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "I know," I said. That was all we needed to say about it. Petra moved out on day 31 of the 60. Not because I pushed her, I didn't. She found a furnished, short-term rental in the Pearl District and announced the move with the kind of efficiency she applied to everything, like it had been the plan all along. Her relationship with Caden did not survive the transition. He told me about it 6 weeks later over the phone, quietly, without drama. He said he'd realized some things during those weeks in the guest room that he should have seen sooner. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it. He's been coming over on Saturday mornings since April. He and my dad have been building raised garden beds in the backyard, 6 of them, along the fence line where the patio furniture used to be. My mother has already ordered her seeds. She knows exactly what she wants to plant and where, because she's been planning this garden for 20 years and she finally has the space. I stopped by last Saturday and found my dad on his knees in the dirt, which he absolutely should not have been doing given the state of his back. But he was laughing at something Caden had said, and neither of them noticed me standing at the gate for a full minute. My mother was on the covered porch with a cup of tea and the seed catalog, her bad knee up on the railing, the afternoon light coming in over her shoulder. The house looked like theirs again. I don't think I've ever spent money that meant more to me than what I spent on that property. Not because of what it is, but because of what it protects. There's a version of my parents that keeps apologizing for existing in corners and on back steps, and that version almost won. I think about that sometimes. How close it came. I bought the house as a gift, but it turned out the gift wasn't the structure, or the square footage, or the walk-in shower, or the fenced yard. The gift was making sure that when someone tried to treat them like guests in their own home, there was a piece of paper that said otherwise. And a daughter who knew how to use it. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that house, and the longer I sit with it, the more I think the real story isn't about Petra at all. Petra was just the pressure. What the situation revealed was everything that had been quietly true for years before she ever showed up. My parents spent their whole lives making themselves smaller so other people could be comfortable. That's not a flaw. It came from somewhere real, from decades of genuinely not having enough, from learning to apologize for their needs before anyone even asked them to. My dad ate standing up in a hallway because he didn't want to inconvenience a woman who had moved into the house I bought for him. My mother wrapped her ceramic rooster in a dish towel and put it in the closet rather than say, "This belongs to me." That's not weakness. That's what happens to people who have spent 35 years making sure everyone else is okay first. The habit gets so deep it starts to look like preference. And Petra recognized it. She didn't manufacture an opportunity, she found one that was already there and walked through it. That's the part I had to reckon with. Nobody forced my parents upstairs. Nobody threatened them. The whole thing happened through accumulated small surrenders, each one reasonable sounding on its own. Each one a little more territory gone. That's how it always works. Not a single dramatic theft, but 100 quiet concessions until one day you're eating soup on the back steps of your own home and telling your daughter it's not as bad as it looks. What changed everything wasn't the trust document. Not really. The document mattered, legally, but the thing that actually broke the pattern was someone refusing to pretend the situation was normal. That was the only move that had any power. Not anger, not a speech. Just a refusal to sit down and smooth it over and let another hour pass in a house where my father's books were boxed up in a guest room closet. I think about Caden a lot too. He's a good person who made bad decisions because he couldn't tolerate conflict and loved someone who was very good at exploiting that. He didn't deceive our parents. He just kept hoping the situation would resolve itself if he stayed still long enough. And situations like that never resolve themselves, they just calcify. The people who are most harmed by someone else's avoidance are always the ones least equipped to demand better. Which in this case was an aging couple who thought their son needed the space more than they did. What I know now, what this whole thing forced me to understand, is that love without boundaries isn't generosity, it's a liability. My parents gave everything they had for 30 years and never once asked for anything back, and that made them easy to take advantage of the moment someone came along who was willing to do it. Protecting them wasn't just about the house. It was about establishing, maybe for the first time, that their needs have weight, that they're allowed to take up space, that the home they live in should feel like theirs. The garden is coming in now. 6 raised beds, neat rows of stakes and string. My dad's handwriting on the little wooden markers. Tomatoes, zucchini, 3 kinds of lettuce, herbs along the south fence. My mother spent 20 years saying someday I'll have a proper garden, and someday turned out to be a Saturday in April, with her son building boxes and her daughter showing up with seedlings. That's what I bought. Not the house, the someday.